And I'd just like to start pointing out a little bit my take in my research, my PhD research, that's about the appropriation of methodologies of archiving by three artists in Brazil from three consecutive generations. And the artists, and specifically the work that I'm going to be talking about today, is from the youngest of this group. And it's a really early piece on his career, and it's really significant in my research as a moment of transition in a concept of memory, when memory starts being understood as something that departs from the present to the past rather than retrieving an event in the past. Okay. So, in 2007, artist Jonathan de Andrade used a book he found in his mother's library as the guiding base for a photo essay. The book, Amor e Felicidade no Casamento, which means love and happiness in marriage, was first published in Brazil in 1960. And it's a manual with questions and answers about, as its back cover states, and I quote, what is marriage, from engagement to the wedding, sexuality, women's psychology, men's psychology, hygiene, pregnancy, baby delivery, regulation of the deliveries, the child's education, couples harmony, and happy marriage, end of quote. Amor e Felicidade no Casamento auto-prescribes itself as a guide that reviews, quote, reviews all the aspects of a couple's union, to all, for women as well for men, in the youth and mature age, end of quote. So this Sex and Marriage Manual was written in 1956 by Fritz Kahn, a German doctor, illustrator, and popular science writer that became known internationally for his body machines illustrations made between the 1920s and the 1950s. And that's the sort of illustration that you might be familiar with about Fritz Kahn. His books, through analogies between the anatomy of the body and machines, capture early 20th century mindset of the belief in technological progress and the consequent industrialization of the human. In Brazil, however, his Sexual and Marriage Guide, a later and more commercial publication, is his most famous work. As one of the only books published about sexual education in Brazil at the time, Amor e Felicidade no Casamento became a reference in the field and had several reeditions during the 70s. And those are some of the covers from the 70s editions, and I think you can get what it became. Hence, while the Western world went through a sexual and cultural revolution in the late 60s, a book that based its marriage science in the patriarchal family models of the 50s kept being a reference in Brazil society. Jonatas, the artist who found this book and made the photo installation we're going to look at, was struck by how the 50s prescription of one unique model for sexual and love relations that he found in the book was a social cultural concept still ingrained not just in the society of his mothers, who first found the book in the beginning of her adult life in the 70s, but also to a certain extent in his present 2000s. According to Jonatas, the conservative values of a patriarchal society survive in northeast Brazil, where he lives, in behaviors that just modernize themselves in appearances as commodities, through new fashions, clothes, gadgets, and industrial goods, but that in essence maintain the dominant conservative values of a stable, heterosexual, commodity or consuming-based marriage. Living in the center of Recife, which is the fifth largest metropolitan town in Brazil and the biggest city in the northeast region, Jonas identified the survival of this conservative social structure in the own body of the city and its architecture. The flats and houses that him as a student used to share with fellow artists in the beginning of the 2000s were former family homes that originated from the 60s and 70s, and that due to socio-economic decline of the center of the city and new waves of property speculation, were left behind by the families to be occupied by cheaper student and office tenancies. So these once large family homes are marked by the 1960s Brazilian interpretation of the modernist architecture, with clean lines and ample spaces that match that decade economic optimism and developmentist mentality of the time. So just as a footnote, Brazil was pretty much an agrarian society in the 50s when there was a quick kind of economic growth and a rise in the middle classes. So the houses from this time have big kitchens that could accommodate the latest white goods, visitors' large living rooms that were meant to be used just in social occasions, garages that could shelter more than one car. So summing up the kind of spaces that reflect the modernization values that were part of a society that in the 60s thought that it was finally meeting progress and industrialization. Living in these houses under a new social set as a student sharing home, Jonatas was confronted by the memory of these spaces through his own experience. An experience that, as we will see, does not belong entirely to the present, but that transits through in-between times. It is common to see in these previously family houses the sort of featured furniture that became out of place with the lifestyle of their new current occupants, as you can see in the first image. So television and book stands that are too large to be entirely occupied by the students' few possessions, for instance, or once immaculate toilets decorated with tiles matching the seats and sinks, now stained by the lack of maintenance, or what in Brazil is called service areas, where full-time maids would wash, iron, and do other heavy cleaning, but that now are often turned into storage room for the maidless students. So having identified traces of the anachronic 50s values surviving in the social and physical structure of his contemporary Recife, Jonatas used these spaces as scenarios for his thought essay. Taking as direction the premises pointed out in Kant's Guide for a Successful Marriage and Sexual Life, Jonatas rehearsed situations of a fictional couple in places that date from the same period that the book was released in Brazil, the early 60s. Interiors of houses, pieces of furniture, and leisure scenes of a married young couple figure in these photographs. As the art critic Moacir dos Anjos wrote regarding the photo installation, and I quote, "Each period of life has its own norms in accordance to social relations, to which the ones that wish to share a life in a certain community adhere to various degrees. Nonetheless, values that once were conventionally taken as granted can seem obtuse in another given time." However, Jonatas' work seems to suggest that the cut between past and present is not so clear, and values that were created in a certain time in society can be further carried as spectral cells that might shape the due to come. As Walter Benjamin observed in the thesis on the philosophy of history, and I quote, "Our image of happiness is truly colored by the time to which the course of our existence has assigned us." So this time that assigns us is not just the present we live in, but, as Benjamin argued, the previous epoch dreamed as our present, installing in experiences as an unconscious collective to the future to come. It is the problematization of this expectation and the allocation of a predetermined future that the archival interplay at Jonatas' work seems to be dealing with. The images that Jonatas produced based on Kant's book and that form the homonymous installation Amor e Felicidade no Casamento, transiting between a fictional creation and a documentation of a social set and time that cross Recife as surviving spectrums. Through the manipulation of the photographic language and a resource of forced chemical aging of the printed photographs, Jonatas underlines a past that is at the same time artificial and real, and that relocates itself in the present, but that can also be manipulated by the present. As Benjamin observed, to articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it as the way it really was. To Benjamin, the true picture of the past cannot be held as a permanent record, but just flits by us, and it can be recognized for a moment in the memory of things and objects. Rather than preserved in things or events in the past, memory transits in between relations and experiences that humankind established with those things. Also to Jonatas, to grasp the past means to have an experience of memory as it flashes up in his relationship with surviving images, objects, and values. Those things and the fascination they exercise on him and his current society are symptoms of both a programming and a pathos of his present. Jonatas' methodology of digging into the material ruins of a time to retrace the surviving connections of the past within his present evokes Benjamin's search of the daily life of the collective through an archaeology of the refuse and detritus of history, as evoked by Benjamin in his unfinished project, the Arcades Project. Examining the 19th century Parisian arcades from different points of view, sociologically, economically, and culturally, Benjamin was looking for their links with what he considered as characteristic phenomena and expressive manifestations of life of that century. That specific time and location, the 19th century Parisian arcades, were for Benjamin a crucial turning point to the industrial modernity and its consequences to a change in people's modes of life. In affinity with Benjamin, Jonatas' work also tends to the investigation about the projection of the historical into the intimate, a point that can be found in the images and things as the experiences of an individual past that can be awakened by the material and collective past. That's because the historical color of a time also assigns the experience of the private. Benjamin pinned down this process of touching the past under his concept of historical awakening through dialectical images. Benjamin affirms that the dialectical image emerged suddenly in a flash. He affirms that every epoch, in fact, not only dreams the one to follow, but in dreaming it precipitates its awakening. So this historical awakening is not the past illuminating the present, but a moment of recognition of the mutual relationship between both. An example given by Benjamin of how this awakening from and to the past is at play in the arts is given through Proust's introduction in his memoir of a process of remembering through the tasting of a Madeleine. For Jonatas, this awakening happened through the book that connected the values of his parents' generation to his own. And furthermore, this book brought the consciousness of how such prescriptions have been shaping his present. Here, just to make clear, I'm not trying to put Jonatas' work on the same footnote as Benjamin's and Proust, but trying to analyze how some of the issues introduced by Benjamin's ideas have been instrumental in reflecting about the shifts in concepts of memory, time, and archival methodologies within the contemporary art practices. If for Benjamin, the 19th century were the collective dream which his contemporary his contemporaries, its hairs, or obliged to re-enter in order to finally be awakened from it. For Jonatas, a similar rite of passage through the anachronic tropical modernism of Recife is necessary in order for us, or its subtropical 21st century hairs, to be awakened to a critical experience of the present and an active participation in the construction of a different future. Jonatas is turning into the mid-century in Brazil as a crucial time in the break of the belief in the industrial development that was followed by the ruins of progress. As Julio Cortázar have affirmed elsewhere, and I quote, "Latin America is not only outside European historical time, but has the right to be, and, what is more, has true the obligation to be." This anachronic time of history that is plural, is reflected in the archival montage methodology of Amor e Felicidade do Casamento. For Benjamin, in the Arcades project, montage was a methodology to overcome the concept and ideology of historical progress. In the Arcades project, notes and quotations and quotes were put together without a textual narrative to connect them. By approximating pieces of rights and refuse of history, Benjamin expected to create a narrative that was not linear and hence that would break with the reading of a history as a progress or a linear development, but instead would give rise to, and I quote, "a world of secret affinities and discontinuous successions." Jonatas also deploys montage of images and loose extracts of texts to communicate among themselves as a methodology. But in his case, not to create an encyclopedia of the discontinuous connections of the past, but to exercise a critical and provisory activation of its remains. Having understood time as a complex and nonlinear construct, where the present is woven of multiple pasts, Jonatas has been developing a process of investigation and activation of the stakes of the past into the present and future. In his installations, through montages, he translates the conceptual complexity of any given event into narrative structures that problematize the access to past and memory as a multidirectional process, not a given event. Furthermore, his work intersects the borders of modes of life that shift in between individual subjectivations, what Jonatas likes to call exercise of desires, and, on the other hand, ready-to-live models imposed upon us. So, grounding his critical investigations in many aspects of the city where he lives, Recife, Jonatas seems to be developing his own methodologies of a cultural anthropology, cannibalizing several references that inform both his contextual environment and himself, such as Brazilian tropicalism, photographist theory, high-end vernacular versions of modernism in Brazilian architecture, local urban movements, and other apparatuses that shape social codes and behaviors, such as, in the case we're looking here, this relationship manual. As Giorgio Agamben reminds us, a contemporary is the one who has a fractured vertebra that does not coincide with the present because he has to conciliate his singular or private time with the historical and collective time. As such, Jonatas' relation with memory is not of rescuing something finished in the past, but activating and generating an ever-changing process that critically reflects the construction of his present. And because the Benjaminian awakening through dialectical images deal with the before as well as the after history, its instrumentalization by contemporary arts can also engender a prophetic gaze that anticipates the new epochs to come. One of the most famous images of Benjamin's thesis of philosophy of history is the Angel of History, inspired in Klee's painting, Angelos Novos, which I'm missing the image here, but I'm sure most of you are aware of it. To the author, to Benjamin, this angel has his face turned towards the past, but has been inevitably pushed by a storm towards the future, to which he has his back turned to. He would like to stay, says Benjamin, to awake the dead and rebuild what have been smashed by the catastrophe of history. But the violence of the storm, or what Benjamin names progress, does not allow this angel other possibility than just witness the destruction and keep moving towards the future. Jonatas, instead, seems to believe that this angel perhaps could do more than just witness. He can also collect the remains of the past to create not a static archive, but to project a different future. Thank you.